The sun hung heavy in the sky, a searing ball of light casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the barren training grounds. Around the wide clearing, students of every imaginable species gathered in small, murmuring groups, their varied forms a living testament to the diversity of the Galactic Academy. Some stood on thick-plated legs, their bodies covered in scales that shimmered like broken glass. Others hovered slightly above the ground, their translucent wings humming in the hot air. Yet, among the kaleidoscope of alien colors and shapes, one figure stood plainly apart. A human boy named Daniel Ross. Daniel adjusted the straps of his utility vest, squinting up at the sheer face of the cliff that loomed ahead. The rock wall stretched into the heavens like a monolith, smooth and merciless, its surface riddled with jagged cracks and treacherous outcrops. From the base, the summit was invisible, swallowed by the harsh glare of the twin suns. His fingers flexed unconsciously at his sides, a restless energy building within him, but his face remained unreadable, calm in a way that sharply contrasted the restless energy buzzing through the crowd. High above the gathered students, the alien professor floated into view atop a circular levitation platform. Professor Threx was an imposing figure by any species standards, with a serpentine lower body coiled beneath a massive torso draped in the ceremonial robes of the Academy. His elongated head, adorned with glittering sensory tendrils, turned slowly from side to side as he surveyed the assembly. When he spoke, his voice boomed through the translator devices pinned to each student's chest, carrying a tone that brooked no argument. "Today's final examination," Threx declared, his voice a rolling tide of authority, "is a simple one. You must ascend to the summit of this cliff using only your natural abilities. No technological assistance will be permitted, no external climbing gear, no powered flight, no chemical enhancements. Only what nature and your wits have provided you." He paused, allowing the statement to sink in. The translator implants buzzed softly as they converted the complex frequencies of his native tongue into the many languages of the crowd. Murmurs broke out instantly. Some students glanced up the impossibly high rock face and shuffled nervously. Others puffed up their chests or clicked their mandibles with bravado, though the bravado was thin and hollow. Daniel remained silent. He knew better than to waste energy on shows of strength. Survival was never about appearing tough. It was about making the right decisions when everyone else panicked. "You have until the twin suns meet the horizon," Professor Threx continued. "Those who fail to reach the summit by sunset will be considered failed candidates. Begin." The levitation platform rose higher and drifted toward an observation platform suspended halfway up the cliff, where other instructors had already assembled. All eyes turned to the cliff once more. The height seemed even more daunting now that failure had a clock ticking behind it. Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath, the air dry and tinged with the mineral scent of the rocks baking in the sun. He stepped back from the main group, avoiding the cluster of alien students who had begun noisily strategizing among themselves. He knew how this would unfold. Overconfidence would destroy many of them before they even left the ground. Others, paralyzed by fear, would waste precious hours hesitating. He had seen it happen before, in simulations and survival exercises, even during his brief time stationed on frontier worlds where real danger had no time for second chances. A tall, four-armed student from a desert species was already at the cliff base, stretching his elongated limbs and digging clawed feet into a crevice. A female from the aquatic tribes, her gills flaring with every breath, squirted a sticky secretion from her palms to help her grip the rock. Across the clearing, a group of winged students flared their feathered limbs, experimentally, before remembering the no-fleet rule and folding them back with visible irritation. Daniel knelt beside a cluster of scrubby bushes and began gathering materials without a word. Thin vines grew twisted through the underbrush, their green strands tough and fibrous. He tugged one free and tested its strength by pulling hard with both hands. It held. A small smile touched his lips. Good. The natural world always had gifts for those who knew where to look. While the others launched themselves at the cliff in displays of raw strength, Daniel methodically collected more vines, braiding them together into thicker cords. He didn't rush. The cliff would not vanish while he worked. He needed a method, not madness. The human mind had always been humanity's greatest tool, more reliable than claws or scales or gossamer wings. Shouts echoed across the clearing as the first failures began. One scaled the first few meters before a rock gave way beneath his foot, sending him sprawling onto the safety net below. Another, attempting to use pure brute strength, burned out his muscles within minutes and dropped like a stone. Each fall was cushioned, of course. The academy was not in the habit of killing its students, but the humiliation was sharp and the time wasted was critical. Daniel ignored the noise. His fingers worked with practiced ease, weaving the vines into a rope strong enough to bear more than his own weight. He lashed stones into the ends, making primitive anchors. He selected a long, thick branch from a fallen tree limb and fashioned a crude but effective lever. It wasn't beautiful, but it would serve. Pausing, Daniel rose to his feet and studied the cliff anew. His mind mapped it in sections, where the cracks widened enough to jam in an anchor, where a narrow ledge could serve as a stepping stone. The climb would be suicidal for those relying solely on their bodies. It demanded a system, a mechanical advantage. The very thing that had allowed humanity to overcome obstacles far greater than itself since the dawn of its history. At the base of the cliff, more students gathered, casting glances at Daniel. Some scoffed at the primitive tools he was assembling. A trio of sharp-clawed reptiles sneered openly, making loud comments in a language Daniel didn't bother to translate. Let them waste their breath. Mockery was no substitute for competence. Daniel finished tying the last knot and slung the coil of rope over his shoulder. He paced toward the cliff base, planting his boots firmly in the dust. Nearby, a student from the crystalline species attempted to phase into the rock, his semi-solid body shimmering and blurring, only to be repelled by the dense mineral structure, thrown backward into the dirt. Crystalline beings cursed vibrantly when frustrated, Daniel noted in passing. He reached a promising crack near the ground and wedged a stone anchor inside, tugging hard to test its grip. It held fast. He tied one end of the rope to it and tossed the free end up the wall, aiming for a ledge he had marked earlier. The first throw missed, so did the second, but the third, a smooth, calculated flick, caught perfectly. Daniel secured it and began testing the pulley system he had improvised. Already the sun was sliding lower, casting long, jagged shadows that sliced across the clearing like dark knives. Time was slipping by, but Daniel's heart remained steady. He knew that racing against the clock led only to mistakes. Precision was faster in the end. The pulley creaked as he shifted his weight onto it, testing the counterbalance. It groaned, but held. Above him, the rough stones beckoned. Higher still, the summit waited. A prize only for those who understood that survival was not about strength alone, but about thinking differently. Daniel glanced back once, seeing the chaos and desperation spreading among the students who had rushed in without a plan. Then he turned his face upward, set his jaw, and began the real work of ascent. The rope tightened beneath Daniel's grip as he pulled himself higher, each hand-over-hand motion methodical and sure. His body moved with the steady rhythm of experience, never rushing, never hesitating. Above him, the rock face loomed, its surface an ever-changing puzzle of narrow ledges, jagged outcroppings, and sheer featureless plains. The pulley system he had devised bore the strain admirably, the braided vines stretching but not snapping, creaking under the shifting weight but holding firm. Daniel's mind worked just as tirelessly as his muscles, calculating each motion, planning 3 steps ahead as he scaled the first dozen meters. Below him, chaos reigned. The students who had rushed into the climb without preparation were already facing grim consequences. A thick-limbed reptilian boy struggled on a narrow ledge, his clawed feet slipping against crumbling stone. His powerful arms found purchase, but his center of gravity betrayed him, and with a guttural roar, he tumbled backward into the netting below. 2 feathered girls from a low-gravity world attempted to flutter their wings for balance, only to have the updraft near the cliff tear their trajectories apart. One crashed sideways into a jagged outcrop, sending rocks raining down. The other spun wildly before slamming into the net in a tangled heap of broken feathers. Daniel heard their frustrated cries distantly, but gave them no more than a passing glance. His focus sharpened as he reached the first ledge he had targeted, a slanted, uneven slab jutting out barely wide enough to crouch upon. He swung himself carefully onto it, bracing against the cliff with his free hand. The wind here was stronger, whipping dust and grit into his face, but he welcomed it. The air's movement hinted at deeper patterns, air currents that could either help or hinder depending on how cleverly he adapted his method. As he crouched, Daniel unwound a second coil of rope from his pack, lashing it quickly to a sturdy-looking rock formation. He understood that this would not be a single, straight climb. The cliff demanded zigzags, cunning shifts and strategy, improvisation. Each checkpoint he established would make the journey safer, not just for himself, but potentially for others. If any of the alien students chose to swallow their pride and follow his path, from his vantage point, he watched the next wave of students attempt the ascent. A broad-shouldered creature, whose body resembled molded clay, attacked the cliff with brute force, punching handholds into the brittle stone. At first, he seemed successful, carving a rough path upward with deafening blows, but the stone, weakened by the impacts, began to fracture further than he intended. Daniel watched as a sudden deep crack split the surface like a wound. The heavy student barely had time to realize his error before a section of the wall crumbled beneath him, sending him plummeting in a shower of dust and rock shards. Others fared little better. A shimmering student from a gas giant attempted to hover just above the surface of the rock, using his natural anti-gravity field, but the dense mineral composition of the cliff disrupted his ability, and he drifted helplessly sideways until gravity reclaimed him. A girl from a planet known for its endless oceans tried using suction pads on her limbs to cling to the wall, but the dry surface provided no purchase. Her desperate scramble ended with a whimper as she slid downward in defeat. Daniel shook his head slightly, almost sadly. Strength, speed, exotic biology, none of it mattered here. This climb demanded foresight, patience, adaptability, qualities that were universally rare, it seemed. He secured his anchor point and tested it by leaning back against the rope, letting it take his full weight. It groaned, but held. Satisfied, he began preparing for the next stretch. Above him, a long vertical seam ran up the cliff like a scar, narrow but consistent. If he could reach it, he could use it like a natural ladder, wedging stones into the crevices for extra support. Meanwhile, on the ground, frustration brewed. A group of students gathered near the cliff base, arguing heatedly in several different tongues. A tall insectoid boy, his mandibles clicking angrily, jabbed an accusatory limb toward the cliff, shouting at no one in particular. A reptilian girl hissed back, her frilled neck inflating in a clear display of anger. No consensus emerged. Instead of cooperating, the students fragmented into smaller factions, each convinced that brute force or biological advantage alone would win the day. Daniel ignored the clamor. He had already learned that arguments served no purpose once the test had begun. Words could not replace action. He tightened the straps of his pack and began the next stage of the ascent, his fingers finding the hairline cracks in the rock with practiced certainty. He moved swiftly now, his confidence growing with every successful maneuver. The pulley system lightened his load, allowing him to conserve strength. He was careful never to overextend, never to trust any handhold or foothold until he had tested it fully. The cliff demanded respect. Those who treated it as a simple obstacle would pay for their arrogance. Halfway up the face, Daniel reached a small outcropping that formed a natural shelf. He pulled himself onto it and rested for a moment, letting his heart rate slow. His gaze drifted outward over the academy grounds. From this height, the world below looked strangely fragile, the sprawling complex of domes and towers miniature beneath the blazing suns. Beyond the academy's borders, endless desert stretched to the horizon, an unforgiving wasteland where only the clever and the prepared could hope to survive. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. Daniel turned to see one of the winged girls, a slim, golden-feathered figure, struggling along a parallel section of the cliff. Her breathing was ragged, her movements frantic. She clung to a narrow ledge with both hands, her wings useless against the crosswinds. Her taloned feet scrabbled for purchase, but the stone offered no mercy. For a brief moment their eyes met across the gulf. Fear shone in hers. Daniel hesitated. His instincts urged him to help, but the distance between them was too great. His system, so carefully designed, could not reach her. He could only watch helplessly as her grip failed. With a cry swallowed instantly by the wind, she fell backward, her golden form spinning down toward the net far below. The sight steeled his resolve. Mercy was important, but only preparation could prevent disaster. Next time, he would be ready to assist. He would find a way to make his system expandable, usable by others. Setting his jaw, Daniel pressed onward. The seam he had identified earlier was close now, the narrow crack extending upward like a hand-carved stairway. He approached carefully, jamming small stones into the gaps to widen them just enough to serve as footholds. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. The cliff had no forgiveness for mistakes. Above him, he could see movement on the professor's observation platform. The instructors leaned forward, watching closely, recording notes. No doubt they had expected the students to fail spectacularly. Perhaps they still would, but Daniel intended to prove otherwise. The higher he climbed, the more the environment shifted against him. The rock grew colder despite the burning suns, and gusts of wind lashed at him from unpredictable angles. Fine dust clogged his throat and stung his eyes. Yet he pressed on, climbing steadily, methodically, a living embodiment of humanity's oldest truth: adapt or perish. Reaching another ledge, Daniel paused again. This time he planted a marker, a piece of bright red cloth tied around a rock spike. It would serve two purposes: a guidepost for himself if he needed to descend rapidly, and a beacon for any students smart enough to follow in his footsteps rather than persist in their futile solo struggles. He tightened the knots securing the next section of rope, double-checking every anchor. Fatigue nipped at the edges of his awareness, but he pushed it aside. The summit was still far, but now he had momentum, and momentum was everything. As he prepared to ascend again, a low rumble echoed through the cliffside. Daniel instinctively flattened himself against the rock as a small landslide spilled down several meters to his left, dislodged by some student's reckless climb. Pebbles rattled past him, some bouncing alarmingly close. He waited until the debris ceased falling before moving again, shifting his route slightly to avoid unstable sections. Every decision mattered now, every handhold, every breath. The cliff no longer felt like a test set by instructors. It felt alive, like an ancient beast testing his worth with every meter gained. Daniel accepted the challenge wordlessly, answering it not with bravado or rage, but with silent, stubborn persistence. Higher and higher he climbed, moving from ledge to crevice to narrow shelf. Behind him, scattered shouts and cries of frustration echoed upward, but they grew fainter with distance. Few students had managed to rise beyond the lower quarter of the cliff. Most had given up, defeated by their own bodies or their lack of preparation. Daniel did not intend to be among them. He had a system, he had a path, he had a purpose. And, above all, he had the unbreakable will to see it through. The sharp winds cut against Daniel's face as he pulled himself onto a precarious ledge no wider than his boots. The cliff had narrowed into a vertical corridor, its walls closing in to form a jagged funnel toward the upper heights. Up here, the atmosphere grew thinner, the air sharper, every breath a little more effort. The strain pressed into Daniel's muscles, but he welcomed the challenge, knowing that every step forward brought him closer not just to the summit, but to something greater. Proof that survival came not from force, but from wit. Gripping the rope he had secured earlier, Daniel stabilized himself and began preparing the next section of his climb. The crack he had been following splintered into thinner veins, too narrow for footholds now. The stone grew glassy and slick, a trap for the careless. Daniel studied the surface carefully, his mind already sketching the framework of a new solution. He unstrapped a small pouch from his belt and retrieved a sharpened piece of stone he had fashioned earlier. With swift, practiced strikes, he began carving small handholds into the brittle surface. Each strike had to be precise. Too shallow, and it would provide no grip. Too deep, and it would fracture the rock, risking collapse. Daniel moved methodically, setting each notch as a step on an invisible staircase that only he could see. Behind him, faint voices echoed upward, others still struggling far below. He could make out the sharp clicks of an insectoid language, the shrill barks of a reptilian tongue, the low murmurs of a crystalline dialect. None of them sounded triumphant. Fatigue, fear, and anger soaked their tones like blood in water. Daniel tightened his jaw. He could not afford distraction. The cliff had claimed the pride of many before him. He would not join them. Once satisfied with the handholds, Daniel tested each one with his weight. They held. Trusting his work, he resumed the climb, moving upward with smooth, economical motions. His arms burned with effort, his fingers scraped raw against the rough stone, but he climbed steadily, driven by a fire that no exhaustion could quench. Above, the sun angled low against the sky, painting the cliff in long shadows and harsh golden light. Time pressed heavily against him now. Daniel measured his progress with each movement, calculating whether he could reach the summit before darkness swallowed the landscape. Failure was not an option he permitted himself to consider. Reaching another outcropping, Daniel anchored a fresh length of vine rope, securing it against a sturdy stone jut. He tied it using a double-clove hitch, strong enough to bear weight, easy enough to release under tension if necessary. Every knot, every rope, every choice was a line of survival carved into the bones of the cliff. As he worked, movement caught his eye. A student, a wiry boy with spiny limbs, was climbing a parallel path a few meters away. His ascent was frantic, desperate. He leapt recklessly from one narrow ledge to another, trusting his natural agility more than the treacherous rock. Daniel recognized the signs of panic. The boy's movements grew sloppier with every meter, his body betraying the growing terror in his mind. Daniel watched as the boy reached for a thin protrusion, his fingers slipping against the dusty stone. For a heartbeat, he hung suspended, his limbs flailing wildly. Then gravity seized him. With a shriek of rage and fear, he fell, bouncing once against an outcrop before disappearing into the void below. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in grim acknowledgement. The cliff showed no mercy to mistakes. He opened his eyes and pressed onward. Another 20 meters passed in a blur of exertion and focus. His body moved on muscle memory now, each motion the culmination of years of training and instinct honed to a razor's edge. His mind remained sharp, however, constantly assessing, adjusting, refining his approach. Near the upper third of the cliff, the nature of the terrain changed once more. The rock shifted from brittle shale to dense basalt, harder and smoother. Handholds grew scarce. Daniel paused, clinging to a narrow crevice, and assessed his options. He could attempt to scale the sheer surface directly, risking a fall, or he could engineer another solution. The decision came swiftly. Survival was never about bravado. It was about playing the odds and bending them to one's favor. Daniel retrieved the last of his vine coils and began constructing a basic grappling line. He tied a heavy stone to the end, fashioning a crude but serviceable throwing weight. Aiming carefully, he hurled it upward toward a small overhang some meters above. The stone arced through the air, the vine hissing behind it like a whip. The first throw missed, the stone bouncing harmlessly against the cliff. Daniel reeled it back patiently and tried again. The second throw caught. The stone wedged itself between two outcrops, anchoring firmly. He tested the rope, pulling with his full weight. It held. Trusting in his work, Daniel swung across the sheer basalt face, using the rope as a pendulum to bypass the smoothest section. His boots skidded against the rock as he landed on a small, cracked ledge. He exhaled sharply, the adrenaline burning through his veins, and immediately set about securing another anchor point. Above him, the summit finally came into view. The final stretch was a steep incline covered in loose scree and sharp ridges, not impossible, but exhausting after the brutal climb. Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction before pushing forward again. He climbed with renewed determination, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The loose stones threatened to betray him, shifting treacherously underfoot, but he adjusted his balance constantly, never giving the cliff a chance to pull him down. Finally, he reached a stable ledge just below the summit. The twin suns hung low on the horizon, casting the world into a surreal palette of gold and blood-red hues. The air here was colder, thinner, filled with the scent of ancient stone and dry, electric wind. Daniel did not celebrate. He knew the true test was not in reaching the top. It was in ensuring others could follow. Without hesitation, he set to work. He reinforced the anchor points he had placed during his ascent, tightening the knots, testing every line of tension. He laid out the path clearly, using markers of bright cloth and etched arrows carved into the rock, guiding anyone who might come after him. He dismantled part of his pulley system and rebuilt it in a simpler, more accessible configuration near the summit, fashioning handholds and foot loops from the braided vines. It would allow weaker climbers to pull themselves the final distance if their strength failed them. Sweat stung his eyes and his arms trembled from the prolonged strain, but he forced himself to finish. He did not know if any of the other students would reach this far, Most were still far below, their progress slowed to a crawl or abandoned entirely. Yet he prepared for them regardless, because victory in Daniel's mind meant more than personal success. It meant proving that true strength lay not in domination, but in lifting others up when they had no strength left. As he tightened the final knot and secured the last line, Daniel rose to his full height and turned toward the summit. A short scramble remained, no more than a dozen meters of rough stone. With a deep breath, he launched himself forward, hands and feet digging into the loose scree, his body moving on pure willpower. Each step drove him closer to the sky, to the burning edge of the horizon, where the twin suns kissed the land goodnight. And then, with one final surge, Daniel crested the summit. He stood atop the world, battered, bruised, victorious. The academy sprawled in miniature beneath him, a glittering constellation of domes and towers amid the vast desert. Above, the stars blinked into life against the indigo sky. Daniel allowed himself a brief, quiet smile. He had not conquered the cliff. He had understood it, respected it, and worked with it. And in doing so, he had won. But his task was not yet complete. Turning back toward the cliff's edge, Daniel knelt and waited, watching for any student who might yet find the strength or the wisdom to follow the path he had prepared. Daniel crouched near the summit, the rough stone biting into his knees as he watched the cliff below. The world around him dimmed under the fading suns, casting the landscape in deep reds and long, trembling shadows. Far beneath him, a few small figures still struggled upward, inching toward the peak with exhausted, faltering movements. Most of the students had abandoned the climb entirely, too battered, too fearful, or too broken to continue. Only a handful persisted, their stubborn silhouettes stark against the cliffs. He knew that reaching the summit alone would not be the ultimate measure of success. He had laid the groundwork, prepared the tools, but now came the true test. Would he extend his hand to others, even if it cost him his position, even if it meant risking what he had earned through blood and will? Daniel stood and adjusted the ropes he had prepared, securing a large loop at the end of the thickest vine. He braced himself against a sturdy boulder, wrapped the vine around his waist for additional leverage, and lowered the loop toward the nearest student. The crude pulley system groaned under the strain, the tension vibrating through the vines and into his arms, but he held firm. The first climber was a broad-shouldered reptilian boy whose green scales were dulled by dust and exhaustion. His sharp claws scrabbled uselessly against the bare stone as he tried to drag himself up the last sheer section. His strength, once his pride, had drained under the unrelenting challenge of the climb. Daniel called out to him, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. The reptilian boy lifted his head, blinking up at him with weary, suspicious eyes. For a long moment he hesitated, pride warred with desperation on his face. Then, with a grunt of surrender, he reached for the dangling loop. Daniel tightened the rope as the boy slipped it under his arms, creating a secure hold. Step by step, hand over hand, Daniel hauled him upward, his muscles screaming with the effort. The reptilian boy kicked against the cliff, aiding the ascent where he could, but most of the burden fell to Daniel. Every meter demanded focus. Every shift of weight threatened to snap the improvised system or wrench the anchor loose. Daniel dug his boots into the rock, braced every muscle in his body, and pulled. Inch by inch, the boy rose until finally, with one final heave, he flopped onto the summit, gasping and trembling. Daniel extended a hand and helped him to his feet. The boy muttered something in his native tongue, words Daniel did not understand, but whose meaning was clear in the look of grudging respect that passed between them. Without another word, the boy staggered to the side, collapsing onto the stone to recover. Daniel turned back to the edge. Another figure approached, a lithe, bird-like girl with tattered golden feathers clinging to her limbs. She moved unsteadily, her hands bloodied and her breathing ragged, yet there was a fire in her dark eyes that had not dimmed, a stubborn spark that refused to die. Daniel lowered the loop once more, guiding it toward her outstretched hands. She slipped it over her shoulders with trembling fingers, and Daniel began the grueling work of pulling her upward. She weighed less than the reptilian boy, but the wind had strengthened with the dying suns, battering her fragile body against the cliff face like a rag doll. Daniel compensated by adjusting the tension, bracing harder, shifting his weight as the gusts tried to rip the vine from his grasp. The pulley strained, fibers creaking ominously, but he refused to yield. His hands blistered against the rough vines, blood mingling with sweat, but he gritted his teeth and pulled. At last, she crested the summit, scrambling onto solid ground with a broken cry of relief. She clutched the rock beneath her with trembling hands, her whole body shaking. Daniel knelt beside her, checking the crude harness for injuries, but she waved him off with a weak smile and a nod of gratitude. Two saved, he rose again, scanning the cliff for more. Far below, a third figure struggled upward, a squat, muscular boy from a methane-breathing world. His body glistened with a viscous sheen as he fought for every handhold. His progress was agonizingly slow, but he had not surrendered. Daniel shouted down to him, swinging the loop in slow arcs to catch his attention. The boy looked up, his wide, luminous eyes reflecting the last light of the sun's. He raised one thick arm in acknowledgement and began angling his climb toward Daniel's position. The weight was excruciating. Every moment felt like an eternity as the boy dragged himself upward. Daniel kept the loop ready, guiding him toward it with terse, precise commands shouted over the wind. When the boy finally reached the right spot, he fumbled with the loop, his fingers clumsy with exhaustion. Daniel saw the moment when the boy's strength gave out. His grip faltered, his body sagged against the cliff. Without hesitation, Daniel threw himself backward, using his full weight to counterbalance the sudden pull. The vine snapped taut, digging deep into his waist, but it held. He grunted, his muscles quivering with the strain, and pulled. The boy, half-conscious, swung helplessly against the cliff, but Daniel refused to let him fall. Step by agonizing step, he dragged the boy upward, his vision narrowing to the singular goal of saving this last climber. When the boy finally collapsed onto the summit, Daniel fell to his knees beside him, gasping for air. His arms felt like lead, his legs like stone, but he had done it. He had saved 3 of them. As he knelt there, shuddering with fatigue, a low hum drifted across the summit. He looked up to see Professor Threck's levitation platform descending from the observation deck. The professor's massive form loomed over them, his tendrils fluttering in the high-altitude wind. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, wiping the blood and dust from his face with a trembling hand. He stood before the professor, the battered students behind him, the pulley system still swaying in the wind. Professor Threck said nothing at first. His eyes, dark and fathomless, studied Daniel in silence. Around the professor, a ring of instructors floated on smaller platforms, their expressions unreadable. The silence stretched long enough that Daniel began to wonder if he had misjudged everything. Then Professor Threck inclined his massive head, a gesture of profound respect among his kind. Without a word, he extended one tendril in a slow, sweeping arc, encompassing Daniel, the students he had saved, and the path he had carved up the cliff. Daniel understood. It was not just about reaching the summit. It was about making sure others could follow. As the twin suns finally dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a deep, violet twilight, Daniel allowed himself to breathe freely for the first time in hours. He had climbed, he had endured, and most importantly, he had lifted others when they could not lift themselves. At that quiet, sacred moment atop the highest point of the Academy grounds, Daniel Ross proved what few ever did, not with noise, not with violence, but with action. The stars blinked to life above him, and the night embraced his victory. The wind howled across the summit, carrying with it the lingering scent of sun-scorched rock and the faint, electric tang of coming night. Daniel stood tall despite the exhaustion weighing down his body, the broken vines of the pulley system trailing from his waist like the tattered remains of a banner won in battle. Around him, the 3 students he had helped sat in stunned silence, their bruised bodies and battered spirits slowly absorbing the reality that they had survived. Professor Threck and the assembled instructors hovered in a semicircle, their robes rippling in the rising breeze. The professor's dark gaze swept across the summit once more, noting every detail, the secured ropes, the anchored vines, the visible path Daniel had carved upward. His tendrils shifted in slow, deliberate movements, a silent language that spoke volumes to the other instructors observing. Without breaking eye contact, the professor drifted closer until he loomed directly before Daniel. His towering form cast a long shadow over the human boy, but Daniel did not flinch. His body ached, his skin bore the raw marks of the climb, but his posture remained unyielding. a living testament to everything he had fought for that day. The professor's voice, when it came, was low and resonant, amplified by the translator pinned to Daniel's chest. "You were given a task to reach the summit," he said, "yet you chose a different path. You built a way for others." Daniel said nothing, knowing that silence could sometimes carry more weight than any words. His steady gaze met the professor's without fear, without pride, only quiet resolve. "Explain your reasoning," Professor Threx commanded. Daniel took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. "The task was to climb," he answered, "but surviving alone proves nothing. If survival is the goal, we must find ways to bring others with us. Strength without compassion is hollow." The professor's tendrils flickered once, an alien gesture whose meaning Daniel could not fully grasp. But the tone of the air shifted subtly, an unspoken acknowledgement that Daniel's words had struck something deep. One of the instructors, a slender being with crystalline skin, floated forward. "You violated no rules," she said, her voice a clear chime against the soughing wind. "You used only natural materials. You depended on ingenuity, not machinery." Another instructor, a heavy-set male with coppery scales, grunted. He displayed leadership, strategy, adaptability. The words washed over Daniel without stirring his composure. He had not acted for praise. He had acted because it was right. Professor Threx turned slightly, addressing the other students who had been rescued. "You reached the summit not by your own strength," he said, "but by accepting help when your strength failed. Remember this: pride kills faster than gravity." The reptilian boy bowed his head low, his hands curled into fists of shame and gratitude. The golden-feathered girl brushed tears from her dirt-smeared cheeks, but stood a little straighter. The methane world boy struggled to rise to his feet, his legs trembling, but he managed to do so under his own power. In each of them, something had shifted. A crack in the armor of arrogance, a seed of humility planted in the harsh soil of the cliff. Professor Threx faced Daniel once more. "You have exceeded the parameters of this examination," he declared. "You have demonstrated qualities beyond physical endurance. You have shown wisdom, foresight, and selflessness. These are the traits of those who lead civilizations, not merely survive them." The announcement carried across the summit, amplified by the translators to every listening ear below. Those students who had abandoned the climb, who had failed to reach even a quarter of the way up, now heard it too. Shame and envy stirred among them, but also something else. A grudging recognition that what Daniel had accomplished mattered far more than a simple, solitary victory. With a formal gesture, Professor Threx produced a slender, silver rod from within his robes. It shimmered in the twilight, casting prismatic reflections across the battered stones. "By the authority vested in me by the Galactic Academy," he said, "I hereby confer upon Daniel Ross the highest commendation for exceptional conduct under trial." Daniel stepped forward, and the professor tapped his shoulder with the rod, the ancient ceremony marking the culmination of the trial. The weight of the moment pressed against Daniel's shoulders, heavier than any burden he had carried on the cliff, but he accepted it with quiet dignity. The instructors bowed as one, a rare and solemn gesture of respect. Professor Threx lowered his platform slightly so that he was at eye level with Daniel. His next words were softer, meant only for the human boy to hear. "You remind us why humanity thrives in places where others perish," he said. "You are not the strongest, you are not the fastest, but you are the most dangerous, not because you destroy, but because you uplift." Daniel met his gaze steadily, feeling no pride, only a deep, resonant understanding. He had not set out to prove humanity's worth to the galaxy. He had only tried to honor the simple truth that survival meant nothing without others to share it with. As the stars deepened overhead and the desert below surrendered fully to the night, the instructors began their descent, guiding the rescued students back toward the academy grounds. Daniel remained atop the summit for a few minutes longer, standing alone against the vastness of the universe. The cliff had tested his body, but the real test had been of his soul, and he had not been found wanting. Finally, he turned away from the edge, his steps steady despite the fatigue gnawing at his limbs. He followed the path he had carved, the path he had made possible for others. Moving forward without fanfare or ceremony, he descended not as a conqueror but as something greater, a builder of bridges where walls had once stood, a reminder to all who witnessed him that the truest strength was not in reaching the summit alone, but in ensuring others could reach it as well. The Galactic Academy would remember Daniel Ross, not as the boy who climbed the cliff, but as the human who taught an entire generation of future leaders that the only victory worth having was the one shared with others. And somewhere, beyond the glittering stars, new challenges waited. Daniel would meet them all the same way he had met the cliff, with steady hands, a fierce heart, and the unshakable belief that together, anything was possible. The night swallowed his silhouette as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind not just a legacy, but a future shaped by the simple, indomitable truth he had proven with every breath. The measure of greatness was not how high one could climb alone, but how many hands one could lift along the way.